Okay, here we are. Last recorded lecture of the semester. Congratulations for making it this far, especially if you've actually watched all of these. I have a sinking feeling that many of you do not. But anyway, hello to the regulars. So, foreign policy. This is luckily where I have the most legit expertise to be talking on the issue. This and presidential power, and that has a lot to do with the fact that presidential power really shapes foreign policy. I'll get to that in a sec. Um, but the most important crisis to have really challenged U.S. foreign policy would be Hamas's attack on Israel in October of 2021. This is a photo. I don't know when it was taken. I just lifted it off the internet, but of President Joe Biden with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Um, there's a lot that could be said about Netanyahu, but I won't. But I will stress that the United States is, I don't know, this isn't the best way to put it, but most important ally or its staunchest ally, I guess, in the Middle East would be Israel. The U.S. foreign policy has definitely evolved over time, and I will say that in spite of Hamas's attack on Israel in October of 2023, I said 2021 a minute ago, sorry. When you get old, your brain does that. But for the first time in my lifetime, and really I think for the first time in the history of U.S. and Israeli relations, I see the current administration taking greater consideration of the interests of Palestinians in this ongoing conflict. But anyway, I'll say a bit more about Israel down the road here. There's just kind of an introduction to U.S. foreign policy here. What foreign policy is, if you want a literal textbook definition here: programs and policies that determine the U.S.'s relations with other states. I'll use the word state often. I'm not referring to Rhode Island or Oregon. I'm referring to countries, which I have in parentheses here, and foreign entities. Coming from the Latin, the French, which the language that really shaped modern diplomacy going back a few hundred years, état or state is the most common word to refer to a political unit, which is no small reason why the United States is made up of states, right? It's just depending on the level in the hierarchy, but the word functions in the same way. It's a political unit or subunit in the case of the United States. But anyway, the United States' chief foreign policy actors, as I implied a minute ago, are the president, and then the executive bureaucracy, which we've also studied, and Congress. And I'll get into a bit of details about all three in a minute, so I won't ramble too much on. I won't ramble at all about them right now. Important to remind ourselves that while foreign policy is well foreign to many of us, U.S. foreign policy is often intertwined with economic and social policy, and I'll again flesh that out when the time comes down the road. Foreign policy traditionally has been thought of as nonpartisan or non-political, apolitical, and I have a strong ahem there afterwards because I think it is safe to say that this is no longer the case. I mean, presidents. It used to be that opposing parties in times of divided government would never criticize a president while the president was overseas representing the United States. This notion of a united front. There was a senator from Michigan in the 1940s, I believe, who said something to the effect of politics ends at the country's shores or something to that effect, meaning that outside of the country we shouldn't play partisan. But I think this is completely, again, gone out the window now in practice. It's yet another political norm, unwritten rule in American politics, U.S. politics, that is no longer respected. Anyway, the United States and any other country on the face of the earth can have relations with other countries and with what we call non-state actors. So the Lowy textbook uses this term nation states. I do not like the term nation state. A lot of political scientists use it. I think it's rather incorrect. But what we're talking about here when we say nation, or when I say it at least, is a political entity consisting of a people with common cultural experiences and identities, languages, religion, so on and so forth. That's what makes up a nation. A state, on the other hand, as I said before, a political unit. So states share a common political authority and are recognized by other sovereign states. That word sovereign, you have maybe heard at one time or another. Sovereignty is autonomy. Sovereignty is independence, right? So a sovereign state is an autonomous, independent state, which is to say, its political system is not shaped by another state, right? That's what it means to be an independent country. But again, the term nation state gets thrown around a lot, all across the social sciences. And what that means, a true nation state is a country, right? A state with its own borders and its own independence and its own autonomy, made up of a population of people who share common cultural experiences, identities, religions, cultures, etc. Right? Most countries or most states are not true nation states. The United States clearly isn't. There were indigenous people who are still here today. The Europeans showed up, and the Europeans were not a united front. Just because they're all white doesn't make them all the same. And then add to that, the forced migration of enslaved peoples, who were all black, but of course didn't share all the same cultural identity, language, religion, etc. So really, if I were to ask you to name a true nation state today, the best answer would probably be North Korea, right? It's a country with its own borders, its own independence, filled with Koreans, ethnic Koreans, and no one wants to migrate there, right? Because it's a dictatorship and it's very poor. A lot of reasons not to migrate to North Korea. It's probably really the only true nation state out there on the face of the earth. Off topic, but anyway, non-state actors are pretty important as well, or can be. These are groups other than a state that attempt to play a role in the international system. So we could think of terrorist groups, international organizations, these things that, again, participate in global politics, the international system, but aren't countries, right? So Hamas might be one that comes to mind in light of how I opened this week's lecture. Al-Qaeda, obviously, ISIS, international organizations like the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, Greenpeace, Amnesty International, the United Nations, for that matter, is an international organization made up of countries, but it in and of itself is a non-state actor, right? So these are the institutions, we'll say, with which the United States has relations through its foreign policy. The main goal of foreign policy should be pretty obvious. Security, right? Keeping people within the borders of the United States safe. Beyond that, we can think of security in other terms, not just your physical integrity and safety from physical harm, but we could think about food supplies, infrastructure, energy supplies, oil, and of course the physical security of the population are protected from foreign threats. That's what foreign policy is meant to do. We could add to this protecting U.S. political institutions. And I'm thinking here about the 2016 presidential election, which it's pretty certain, and this is not a partisan statement. I'm not blaming anyone but Vladimir Putin for this, but the attempts to influence the presidential election several years ago, I think is probably more on the forefront of the minds of those who work particularly in cybersecurity for the federal government. Security strategies here. I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. Isolationism, right? To be isolated, to be alone, the desire to avoid involvement in the affairs of other states. This was pretty much how the United States operated its foreign policy from the founding until about World War I say here strategy with caveats. A major caveat might be the Monroe Doctrine, which came about after the Spanish Empire really collapsed, not entirely, but almost in the early 1800s. And that's when most countries or states throughout Latin America gained independence from Spain and Brazil from Portugal in 1822. And the United States stepped in and told the European powers, hey, Latin America is our backyard, you stay out of it. So that would be an exception to isolationism. It's not the United States invaded the whole of Latin America 200 years ago in the 1820s. That wasn't the case, but the United States, again, being the superpower of the Americas, was able to tell Europe to, again, just not interfere in Latin America. That the United States basically reserved the right to interfere in Latin America. That's where I'm going with that. But anyway, moving on. Other security strategies, we got some different ones come World War II. Appeasement. If you had a world history class of any kind in high school or college, you've probably heard this term. This was an effort to forestall the Second World War, to be specific, by giving in to the demands of a hostile power, basically the United States, France, the UK, to appease the Hitler regime, allowed it to invade Czechoslovakia in the early 1940s. And the thinking was, well, we'll just let Hitler take over this one, small Central European country, and then he won't go any further. And we know that didn't happen. So appeasement is never really, the historical evaluation of appeasement has not been a good one. It's not been viewed as a very good security strategy, which I think is why still continuing to support Ukrainians in the face of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine still matters, right? Because to let Putin just take more of Ukraine would be to appease that power, and I don't think that will end well. I think Putin would be emboldened if appeasement were the option. Containment. Again, if you've taken a 20th century history class, you might have heard this term. This was very much a Cold War policy that was designed to curtail political and military expansion of hostile powers, particularly communist powers. This really was solidified in what we call the Truman Doctrine, right? Truman became president after Franklin Delano Roosevelt dropped dead in 1945, I think. And Truman took over as president. And of course, dropped a couple of bombs on Japan, nuclear weapons, to end the war. And after World War II, the United States was hell-bent on preventing any sort of expansion of communism to any other states that weren't communist at the time. It also led to, how do I want to word this? A greater expansion of U.S. interference in other countries around the world in the name of containment and anti-communism. This Truman Doctrine was the quick and dirty definition of it is Truman's policy to prevent the expansion of communism. Now, if you go to a place like Turkey, you go to a place like Greece, you can go places around, really all over the Middle East. And if you ask around, you can probably, in certain circles, hear quite a lot of criticism of post-World War II U.S. foreign policy, and particularly the Truman Doctrine. We tell ourselves that we're just this innocent superpower, just always out trying to do the right thing. And in the name of containment, our government didn't really do, it wasn't as innocent and kind and polite as we like to think we are. So the first hyperlink here, the Truman Doctrine, will take you to a quick PBS interview with an author by the name of Susie Hansen, who will speak of her first stint in Turkey when she really learned the extent of what the Truman Doctrine brought about in Turkey after World War II. I have lived in Turkey for about 6 months, about a decade ago. And definitely am on board with her analysis. And then this article here, Unlearning the Myth of American Innocence, is an article written by Susie Hansen that I highly recommend. If you're at all interested in maybe a bit of a more critical view of U.S. foreign policy, and she ties it well back into good old racism at home as well. It's a good article to read. I recommend it if you're at all interested in such things. Won't be on the exam, don't sweat it. But for those of you who maybe want to, just out of your own personal interest, save it and read it over the Christmas break. I think many of you, would enjoy it. Deterrence, continuing back with security strategies, came about in the Cold War and beyond. The development, what we mean by this is the development and maintenance of military strength to discourage attack. This really, beyond the immediate aftermath of World War II, this deterrence would be the arms race with the Soviet Union, for example. Like the United States and the Soviet Union during the mid 1940s till the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, basically just spent a bunch of time and money and brain power trying to build deadlier and deadlier weapons to prevent the other from attacking them. So, that arguably worked. Historians tell us that it did. I mean, the proof being that there was no World War III, hasn't been yet. The United States and the Soviet Union did not go to war with nuclear weapons. So, did deterrence work? I suppose, but at great cost. Anyway, um, I liked these photos here in the Lowy text. This is the photo on the right is from the newest edition of the Lowy text. So if you're reading the 2019 edition, maybe you didn't see this, but this notion of America first, while many of you probably associate this notion with a certain recent former president, Trump, make America great again and such, America first. The notion is not new, right? The notion is not new at all. The photo on the left here, I believe, is from the run up to World War One, might be World War Two, I forget. But this notion of keeping U.S. Service people out of war is not a new one. It's really not. And I say here in the heading of the slide, I recommend HBO's The Plot Against America. It takes place in the run up to World War II and after it begins. Sorry. But it does a good job of showing this continued isolationist sentiment in the United States that I think Trump has managed to rekindle in U.S. Politics today. Whether that's building a wall to isolate the United States, or wanting to not support Ukraine, for example, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? We kind of pendulum swing back and forth at times when the public opinion at least is much in support of U.S. engagement with the wider world, often in the form of war, and then times where we feel much more isolationist. No value judgment. It's just a statement of fact. We go back and forth. The Cold War was a time when we very much, the broad we, the United States, was very concerned about the wider world. Again, particularly because of the perceived threat from the Soviet Union, the expansion of communism. So the Cold War is this period from the end of World War II to about 1990. It's called the Cold War because it was not hot, right? The United States and the Soviet Union never directly engaged in military conflict. However, there's a short link here to just a few minutes from one of my favorite documentaries called The Fog of War that came out nearly 20 years ago because I'm old, in which Robert McNamara, who was President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, talks about how close the United States and the Soviet Union were to a nuclear war in 1962 over Cuba. The Cuban regime, communist by that time and an ally of the Soviet Union, decided to secretly house nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from Florida. And the United States discovered this and was not very happy about it. I'll leave it at that. But watch that clip if you're interested in such historical things. It's short. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War and arguably a victory for the policy of containment and deterrence, perhaps. But this follow-up with Castro from 1992 is another clip from the same 2004 film, The Fog of War, in which Robert McNamara talks of meeting Castro in the early 1990s, in which Castro told McNamara in no uncertain terms that he was willing to basically, allow the Soviets to fire nuclear weapons at the United States in 1962. So, 60 some years ago and change, it had different decisions been made, we wouldn't be sitting here right now in this class, you listening to this boring lecture, because the world would have been toast. Shifting gears here, more to the 21st century. Perhaps you've heard these terms thrown around. Most likely you have not. But this notion of preemptive versus preventive war. Preemptive war is a type of war that the United States could engage in, any other country in the world could too, but a war that's launched in anticipation of an immediate aggression by another party. International law, the United Nations, narrowly allows for states to engage in preemptive war This would have been, say, an example, hypothetical, might have been if, as Russian troops were lining up along the border with Ukraine and in Belarus, with the border with Ukraine, Belarus being a Russian ally, when it really looks like in early 2022 that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine, had Ukraine preemptively launched an attack in the face of likely immediate aggression, that arguably might have been legal in international law. Preventive war, and I realize that the terms are quite subtly different, but preventive war is an attempt to destroy a potential threat before it has the opportunity to become an immediate aggression, right? So the difference is, it's like acting in self-defense. If you perceive an immediate and obvious act of aggression coming your way, you can defend yourself. A preventive war would be, well, this country might attack us someday down the road. We think we might, we don't know, but just in case, we're going to go invade. And that is not legal under international law. But to use this word doctrine again, would be, how do we describe a doctrine? A way of thinking. And not every president gets the word doctrine slapped after their name. But in the case of Truman, in the case of George W. Bush, we do get doctrines here. The Bush Doctrine came about after September 11th, which argued that the United States should take preemptive action against threats to national security. As if you recall the Vice film, the invasion of Iraq, all these things, this really was viewed by many, the Bush Doctrine, as preventative war, or preventative war, which really, according to many observers, is not legal under international law. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was really not at all legal under international law. Anyway, moving on here. Fast forward a bit to the Obama administration, 2015. The text mentions a bit about the Iran nuclear deal. The United States had an interest in negotiating with Iran, which past administrations really had not been willing to do since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. There's been a real distance between the United States and Iran. And the United States has sanctioned Iran pretty heavily, basically trying to isolate the Iranian economy from the global economy as best it can. But this deal signed in 2015 between the United States, Iran, and some other international actors, the United Nations, the EU, Germany, Russia, etc., led to the United States easing sanctions, so inviting Iran back into the global economy in exchange for the Iranians agreeing to not pursue a nuclear weapons program. I mean, that's the broad gist of the deal. This hyperlink here will take you to a John Oliver analysis of it. But I leave the slide in here just to stress the point that the United States in its foreign policy really has its fingers in cookie jars all over the world, and for lots of differing reasons. The Iran deal being a security reason to try to limit the potential longer-term nuclear threat of a long-term adversary in Iran. But shifting gears from security to the economy, a second foreign policy goal is promoting economic prosperity, right? And presidents know this better than anyone. When the economy is good, presidential approval rating tends to be higher. When the economy is bad, presidential approval rating goes down, and foreign policy crises can really have an impact on the economy. We could talk of the World Trade Organization. That's what the WTO is. The United States is a big, important player within the WTO, logically. And the United States is pretty important in granting what's called most favored nation status. I don't like the term nation there, but it's not my term. It's a WTO term, which is an agreement to offer a trading partner the lowest tariff rate possible to other trading partners, right? And tariff is just a tax on imports, right? So if a tariff gets lowered to zero, then we call that free trade. There's no taxes on the movement of goods across international borders, which the United States used to be pretty in favor of until the Trump administration, it seems. But bestowing most favored nation status via the WTO is a way to encourage trade with other international partners. which is usually generally pretty good for the U.S. economy. We could talk about other examples of trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we called NAFTA. This went back to 1994. It was negotiated by Republican George H.W. Bush, came into force under Democrat Bill Clinton. Both parties were generally pretty in favor of it, which sought to eliminate, well, lower initially and then to eliminate all tariffs among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. The Trump administration decided to renegotiate this in 2018 as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA, which always makes me think of the damn YMCA song. You're welcome, if that does the same for you. But I really can't see great differences between NAFTA and the USMCA. Back in 2018, a lot of observers like me just seemed to think that that was a needless renegotiation, but nonetheless, it was. We could also talk of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an initiative that began under the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, and then really heavily negotiated under the Obama administration. It was meant to be a partnership made up of most countries bordering the Pacific Ocean, except for China. The purpose was to try to isolate the Chinese economy by creating a free trade zone of all the other countries almost that bordered, that had a shore on the Pacific. The Trump administration decided to shoot that down with the claim that Trump wanted to negotiate individually with other countries and not create more broad trade agreements. Again, a lot of observers thought that was pretty silly because, again, the idea was to isolate the Chinese economy and thus indirectly strengthen all the other economies of the countries within the partnership, making them stronger vis-a-vis China than they would be otherwise. Not a bad plan, so many Republicans and Democrats thought. But anyway, just an example of how foreign policy can shape economic policy and vice versa, really. A third goal of foreign policy is humanitarian concerns. This would particularly be the case if we think about Israel-Palestine in late 2023. The United States, I'm glad, is still very staunchly pro-Israel. But again, for the first time in my lifetime, really, I think taking a much more serious approach to the understanding and protection of the human rights of Palestinians in the process. But we can talk of human rights, we can talk of environmental protection, peacekeeping efforts, etc., aimed at improving the lives of individuals in other states. This is a goal of foreign policy. Humanitarian concerns frequently take a backseat to security and economic interests because, selfishness. That's pretty much how that works. Nonetheless, the United States government is very good at patting itself on the back, especially because of what is done by the USAID. It's not called USAID, although a lot of people do call it that. USAID is the Agency for International Development. It's part of the State Department, which is the main diplomatic body of the executive branch, right? Of an extension of the president's office, right? But USAID does some good things, I would argue. I've actually done some work through USAID in Paraguay about 10 years ago. I went to promote democracy after there was a coup there in 2012. I went in 2013 and gave a series of lectures paid for by USAID in Paraguay to promote democracy. Democratic institutions, the things I talk about in this class quite a bit. We can talk about environmental concerns as humanitarian policy, both foreign and domestic, right outside of the borders, because climate, the environment don't recognize political borders, So, but this photo is taken from the Katznelson text, which was published way back in 2014. So it's I'm almost surprised to be reminded that there were electric cars charging like that a long time ago. Well, a long air quotes again, a long time ago, a decade or so ago. A lot's changed since then, but we can definitely think of environmental concerns as humanitarian policy, as a form of an extension of U.S. foreign policy. Excuse me. The hyperlink here will take you to yet another John Oliver 20-minute and change analysis of the Paris Climate Agreement. Anyway. If you're into things environmental, I suggest you watch that. Discussion question here. Which of the following goals do you believe best motivates U.S. foreign policy objectives? This is a softball question. We very much know, and I don't know where the other, I thought I had the highlighted in bold answer. It is, of course, security concerns. We put security above all else. I'm kind of sighing here. This is arguably sometimes to our own security detriment. Do we put security so far ahead? But anyway, economic concerns, humanitarian concerns. Think about it this way: if you recall, toward the end of the Vice film, right near the very end, after Iraq had been invaded, I'm thinking of a different movie. My bad. I'm thinking of Charlie Wilson's War. Ignore what I just said. Nonetheless, security comes first. I put economic at a close second, and then humanitarian concerns at arguably a distant third. Thinking about who makes foreign policy, the president is the head of state and commander in chief. So the president has the most things to do when it comes to foreign policy. The president is allowed to exercise substantial control over U.S. diplomatic and military institutions. That's what it means to be the head of state. You're the head diplomat, and the commander in chief. You're the head, military decider, for lack of a better term. Presidential authority over foreign policy has grown substantially in the post-World War II era. We talked earlier in the semester that this presidential authority has grown in general, particularly since World War II, but exponentially more so when it comes to foreign policy. I think the impeachment of 2020, Trump's first impeachment to keep him separated, would be an indicator, right? The first impeachment of President Trump came way before the Russians invaded Ukraine, but it had to do with Ukraine because in a phone call with the Ukrainian president, the U.S. President Trump asked for political dirt on President Biden, like asking, "Hey, President of Ukraine, by chance, do you have any dirt to share with me? And if you don't share with me, then the United States won't give you money in military aid." And that got President Trump impeached because you're not supposed to use a foreign government for political ends at home. But the fact that presidents get to call other presidents is just an indicator of presidential authority in foreign policy. That's all I'm saying about that. I don't mean to be super political and point fingers at Trump necessarily in that little story there. But this here was the cover of the New York Times, the front page the day after bin Laden had been assassinated in Pakistan by U.S. forces. This was a presidential decision made by then President Obama with zero congressional input or oversight, none whatsoever. And there was a news story not too long ago that came out that argued that then Vice President Biden was not sold on that operation to kill bin Laden. I mean, not because Biden wanted bin Laden to, be able to waltz around a free man in Pakistan, but I think he was concerned about the logistics of it. But again, I just stress the point here that presidents get to make very influential, high-pressure decisions. An extension of the White House is, of course, the bureaucracy. Numerous bureaucratic agencies exist to implement U.S. foreign policy. The most important three here, I would argue, I put on the slides: State Department, the Department of Defense, and the CIA. But it is important to understand that these agencies do not always agree with each other, nor do they always have the same interests. The first interest of most of these institutions is to just protect their own interest, and that is usually the bottom line. Right? They all depend on congressional funding. So, the fact that there are 17 total spy agencies, and that's expanded since September 11th to include the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence. These are meant to coordinate the spy agencies within the United States, but some historians have started to tell us that a lack of coordination among the spy agencies in the run-up to September 11th made it happen. Supposedly, the CIA and the FBI both had a lot of info on Al-Qaeda in the United States. to attack the United States, possibly flying planes, et cetera, et cetera. But they didn't share the information that they had because neither the FBI nor the CIA wanted the other institution to get credit, get the limelight for preventing an attack. And then what happened? So, bureaucracies, as we studied when we talked about the bureaucracy, are often hard to manage, right? Continuing with the making of foreign policy, Congress is definitely worth a mention, right? Congress, of course, is the only constitutional power to declare war, although that hasn't happened since World War II. What Congress does now, and you'll see this in the film Why We Fight, should you choose to watch it, Congress votes to authorize the president to use force. The Congress basically abdicates its constitutional authority to declare war. That's been the norm since World War II, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. The Senate only, so not the House of Representatives, ratifies treaties and confirms presidential appointments. But when it comes to treaties, of course, presidents can work around the need for ratification by simply calling a treaty an executive agreement. We talked about that when we talked about the presidency. Congress has the power of the purse, as we know, right? All spending bills began in Congress and specifically in the House. So Congress can sometimes threaten to cut off funding for foreign policy actions that presidents take. It's rare that it happens, but it can. Power to regulate commerce with foreign countries, that's in the Constitution. Congress passes laws that regulate, international trade, or American U.S. corporation and individuals' roles in it. Congress can investigate and has oversight, right? Can hold hearings and investigate, question people under oath. Congress passed a law after, as the Vietnam War came to an end, called the War Powers Act, which was meant to limit presidential decision making and the ability to use force without congressional oversight. And that has been influential today. This hyperlink goes to an NPR, I think, written story. I don't know if there's an audio component to it or not to listen to, but it became relevant again in 2018 when Congress was critical of the Trump administration's role in a conflict between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. But if you're at all interested in Middle Eastern politics, have a read of that article. It's not that long, but you'll see mention of the War Powers Act and, again, how it is relevant today. Interest groups do not make U.S. foreign policy directly, but they can be very influential in how it is made. And that's by pressuring Congress, members of Congress, and the White House. Economic interest groups or single issue groups are often the most effective. And we could talk about the military industrial complex as an example. What we mean by this, and this will become very clear in the film Why We Fight, which is why I plug it right there. President Eisenhower, World War II general, became president in the 1950s. Late 1940s? No, early 1950s to 1960 for 2 terms was Eisenhower. And on his way out the door, and the film opens with his farewell address, he warns the public of the influence of the military-industrial complex, which is basically just an umbrella term that refers to all arms producers within the United States. War is very profitable for the people who make instruments of war. So if we want to think about the advantage of business in the U.S. political system, if we want to think more broadly about Katznelson's discussion of democracy and capitalism, maybe versus isn't the right word, but democracy and capitalism, democracy / capitalism, democracy versus capitalism sometimes. The arms industry is very influential in U.S. foreign policy, and I'll drive the point home in the last slides that I show you. But worth thinking about this before you watch and during your viewing of the film Why We Fight. We could also talk of ethnic lobbying. There are more ethnic lobbies in the United States than the Israeli lobby, the Irish lobby, the Armenian lobby, etc. And I use the term lobby with quotes there because they're not lobbies in the sense of like business lobbies. And the influences has waned over time. Like the Irish lobby isn't as strong as it used to be. The Israeli lobby continues to be pretty influential. The Armenian lobby, for lack of a better term, after World War One, Turkey arguably engaged in genocide of Armenians, the neighboring Armenian neighbors, Turkey. They're ethnic Armenians that used to live in Turkey, and a lot of Armenians came to the United States today. The Kardashians, Robert Kardashian was of Armenian descent, as are the daughters today. So if you ever watch a Kardashian do or say anything, one, you're wasting your time, and two, you've seen a person of ethnic Armenian descent. But the Armenians traditionally had been pretty influential at maybe ensuring that the United States and Turkey never got too close to each other. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. We can talk about human rights interest groups, whether that's Amnesty International, the Christian Coalition. These are obviously very different groups. Amnesty International fights for the rights of and freedoms of political prisoners. The Christian Coalition is very interested in limiting abortion, particularly U.S. Aided or funded abortions overseas. And I don't necessarily agree with that as a human right, but I understand that some people do. There it is, limiting the right of the or protecting the rights of the unborn. I lay it out in that context. I'm not endorsing that view. I'm just describing it. The Lowy textbook talks of military contractors. I don't recall off the top of my head to what extent Katznelson does, but he should. But military or private military contractors, the notion really came about during the occupation of Iraq in the early 2000s. Although military contractors had existed prior, what contractors are is often former U.S. soldiers who then work for a private security company. This is part of the military industrial complex today. And the reason that they do this is because there's money to be made. The private companies get contracts directly with the federal government. And the nice thing is for the federal government or for any president is that contractors can get away with doing a lot more things that would arguably be illegal for serving military service people to engage in. So yeah, it's pretty nefarious, I would argue. But contractors are very much a reality for U.S. foreign policy today. Interest groups still very relevant. You might recognize this lady. This was Hillary Clinton. She ran for president in 2016 and lost to Trump. But this is her speaking at the American Israeli Political Action Committee conference. So AIPAC is a major pro-Israeli lobby, and both major parties have very close ties to AIPAC. Both presidential parties or both major parties come presidential election time is what I meant to say. Very much are interested in gaining the support of AIPAC. And this helps to explain the tight relations between the United States and Israel as well, which takes me back to the initial slide that I showed you. But quiz question here. Which of the following institutions of the U.S. government is explicitly given the power to declare war by the Constitution? This is a memory question, but it will be, or a similar question will be on the final, I'm sure. We know that this is Congress. Again, we know now that Congress, since World War II, has never declared war. It holds votes to authorize the president to use force. I promise I'm nearing the end here. I think I've got maybe 9 slides left. Crisis and foreign policy. We talked about crisis and the presidency several weeks ago. So it should not surprise you that times of crisis tend to concentrate foreign policy power in the hands of the president. It happens domestically as well. Domestic crisis tends to concentrate domestic policy power in the hands of the president. Same thing happens with foreign policy. So in general, presidents wield far more power over foreign policy than domestic policy, and in practice, far more power over foreign policy than Congress, crisis or not. But that is by design to an extent. Although I don't think the founders would be thrilled about how much presidential power regarding foreign policy has evolved, strengthened over time. Instruments of foreign policy, shifting gears, Diplomacy is, of course, representation of a government to other governments. The Department of State, or we sometimes call it the State Department, is the national government's chief diplomatic arm. The Foreign Service Act, signed shortly after World War II, created a fully professional diplomatic corps. I have three times taken the Foreign Service exam. I've passed it twice. So you pass that exam, you get a face-to-face interview in DC. I've done that twice and not gotten a job. But when in my younger days, finishing college and finishing my first master's degree, I thought I wanted to go work for the State Department. I've subsequently worked and interacted with a lot of State Department folks since then. It's kind of a tough life. It's not really as glamorous as it might sound. Like, not everybody gets to go work in the Paris embassy. And folks move around to different countries every 6 months, year, 2 years. It's tough. So I'm kind of glad I didn't go that route. The United Nations is an institution I'm sure you've at least heard of. You might not know much about, but it was founded in 1945. Again, that you should notice 45 being a pretty key year to U.S. foreign policy history, right? It's immediately after World War II. But the United Nations was founded in 1945 to be a channel for negotiation and a means of settling international disputes peaceably. There are two major bodies within the United Nations: the General Assembly, which includes all member states, so all countries around the globe. I think all states now are members. Switzerland famously maintains a policy of neutrality, but eventually joined the UN a handful of years ago. And then there's the UN Security Council. The General Assembly functions kind of like a parliament or Congress. Things are debated, they pass resolutions, but unfortunately for international law, resolutions passed by the General Assembly are not law. They're merely basically just points of advisement, which really are meaningless in practice. The Security Council, however, is made up of 15 member states, 5 of which are permanent. The United States, Russia, France, China, and the UK. These are the allies that won World War II. Right? Remind ourselves, the Soviet Union and China were allies of the United States, France, and UK in World War II against Japan, Italy, and of course Germany. Right? So again, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China were allies during World War II, and these thus were the victorious countries in the aftermath of World War II, and they gave themselves permission to be permanent members of the Security Council. There are 10 other members that rotate in 2-year stints from all around the world to make up the 15 members of the Security Council. The thing that makes it interesting is that the Security Council is the only body that issues resolutions that are legally binding, but all of the permanent members hold what we call veto power of council resolutions, which means, it's very hard to pass any sort of resolution that's critical of any of these 5 permanent members, right? Russia invaded Ukraine. There has not been a Security Council resolution to condemn the Russian invasion because anytime it's proposed, Russia just vetoes it. So that's why they don't even, no members even propose the resolution. So the United Nations is a very ineffectual institution. I mean, I study it, I appreciate it, I support it in theory, in its aims, but it's very ineffectual when the General Assembly, that's inclusive of all member states, can't make a decision that means a damn thing, and then the Security Council can't pass a binding resolution that intersects negatively with the interests of any of the 5 permanent members. Anyway, enough of my international politics rant. Other tools of foreign policy for the United States: economic aid and sanctions. Each year, the United States provides about $30 billion in economic assistance to other countries. And about 10% plus of this, I think it's up to $3.8 billion a year, goes directly to Israel, which is the number one recipient of U.S. Foreign assistance. A lot of that money goes for Israeli defense and a lot of that money then gets channeled back to the United States and its weapons producers. But anyway, Israel is the number one recipient of U.S. aid. Egypt is number two. This is a consequence of the Camp David Accord from the 1990s. It's in effect a way to, since Israel and Egypt border each other and have traditionally had territorial disputes, by giving Egypt a lot of aid, foreign assistance from the U.S. government. It's a way to basically buy peace between the two neighboring countries. But it is worth pointing out in 2021, the gross domestic product per capita in Israel was over $52,000, which rivals the United States, is way higher than a lot of even European developed countries. So I sometimes scratch my head and ask myself, why does the United States need to give so much aid to a country that itself is very, comparatively one of the wealthiest countries on the face of the earth? Things for you to think about. I'll say nothing more beyond that. Egypt is a much poorer country with an annual income per person of about just under 4,000. And I don't know off the top of my head how much Egypt receives a year, but it's considerably less than $3 billion. But anyway, aid is in effect the carrot of U.S. foreign policy, and economic sanctions are the stick, right? And sanctions are economic punishments on a country, right? The United States, being the world's largest economy, is very influential. If the United States wants to try to hinder, like the Iranian economy I mentioned a bit ago, it could basically do what it can to prevent other countries from trading with Iran, right? The United States can say you either trade with Iran or you trade with us, which leads to, countries like Iran and North Korea having very few effective economic trading partners and allies, right? So that would be the stick, if you will. Collective security. This term is when we use this term when countries form alliances to better provide security for all members of the alliance. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, should be one you've heard of. It came about after World War II, surprise, surprise, and includes the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe. And this institution was created to counter the perceived threat from the Soviet Union. The way NATO works is an attack on one is an attack on all. The Soviet Union created something similar called the Warsaw Pact that no longer exists. But again, this was all the context of the Cold War. Nonetheless, since the 1990s, NATO has played a surprisingly central role in a number of regional conflicts around the world. NATO officially sent troops to Afghanistan and to Iraq after September 11th, at least Afghanistan, I think. NATO's been pretty active in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the aftermath, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, so on and so forth. So these collective security agreements are important as well. More broadly, a quick thought on the United States' role in world politics. It ebbs and it flows. Whether we ask ourselves, or you want to talk to somebody about the Truman Doctrine in Turkey, Greece, etc., Cyprus, Crete, in particular within Greece, not so good. The United States, I think, gave itself a black eye by opening up this Camp X-ray at Guantanamo Bay. There are still people held there. This is a naval base on the island of Cuba that the United States had well before the Cuban Communist Revolution. But as the War on Terror developed after September 11th, as the United States just plucked people off the battlefield, particularly in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, it would send prisoners to this naval base in Cuba because the law basically didn't apply. And I think at one point there were upwards of 1,000 people prisoners held there. And as early as 2008, both presidential candidates, Obama and McCain, swore that if they had been elected in their first term, they would have closed that prison. It is still open today. So because I think we're down to like 50 some people who are still held there, it's because the United States can't find a country to take them. So again, it's an example of just a very poorly thought out decision made by the then Bush administration that reverberates today. But I have this slide here to remind us that this distrust, mistrust of United States foreign policy very much is bipartisan. I think this picture was taken in Egypt when Obama came to give a talk in June of 2009, if I'm not mistaken, where I tracked this down. But if you ever hear your drunk uncle, I have one, say something like, Obama was an appeaser who, just wanted to walk around and ask the United States, ask other countries for forgiveness and this, that, the other, as if Obama was some worshipped figure by those who, the aforementioned drunk uncle doesn't like. This is not true. This is just not true. It's just not true. Too many decades of too many decisions affecting too many other people's lives outside of the United States has led a lot of observers around the world and regular folks to not be very appreciative of U.S. Intervention in any form or on behalf of any president. Okay, worth putting that out there. As I wrap up here, military force is what has gotten the United States, I think, into the most trouble. Again, the example of the invasion of Iraq, and then the Camp X-ray at Guantanamo Bay being a good example of that. But it's also very costly to use military force, right? So it's really meant to be a tool of last resort. It's also inherently risky, again, because you just don't know how things are going to turn out. So as an instrument of policy, military action is pretty risky because the outcomes are uncertain, right? And this is despite how easily outcomes are often presented to the public, right? I think we saw that in the Vice film. You'll see it in Why We Fight. Very documented examples of folks in the Bush administration saying, "Oh, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to be greeted as liberators. This is going to be just a very quick and easy war." And it lasted nearly 20 years. So, each military action brings with it the threat of casualties, loss of life, and again, great expense, and arguably can weaken the United States in the longer term. Nonetheless, the United States does like to spend a lot of money on its military. This is from the latest edition of the Lowy text, shares of world military expenditures in 2020. And you can see that the United States, hands down, spends way more money than anybody else, right? Out of the largest 10 spenders, the United States spends 40% of that total. And thus, like 3 times as much as what the world number 2 in China spends on its military. And as you go down the list, those numbers get a lot smaller. And really, with the exception of China, all of the countries on this list are nominally, well, and Russia, of course, are nominally U.S. allies. So, why the need to spend so much money? That will be addressed in the Why We Fight film. So pay attention to that when you see it. How about cutting defense spending? And again, this will be more specifically addressed, not so much with the numbers and pie charts in the Why We Fight movie, but think about this when you watch it. What we call mandatory spending, I think I addressed that in the last week's collection of slides on public policy, domestic policy. Mandatory spending is things like Social Security, Medicare, these things that by law the government has to spend. Discretionary spending is the spending that Congress any given year can decide how to spend. And nearly half of what Congress can choose to spend, it chooses to spend on defense. So in 2017, you're talking nearly 3/4 or 2/3 of $1 trillion, $608 billion spent on airplanes and bombs and things of that nature. U.S. military spending, defense spending, traditionally has just gone up and up and up over time. Estimates projecting out have it leveling off just a bit, and that's really out of necessity. Especially as our society is getting older and older, which I addressed last week. What the government is going to mandatorily have to spend on Social Security is only going to go up and up, and unless we raise taxes or, well, that's about it. Raise taxes, increase the retirement age, or spend less on defense, we're going to have real budget problems from here on out. Oh, and that is my last slide. So there we go. I'll leave it at that. We can talk about this when we reconvene uh, in a bit. But there we are, just under an hour. Wanted to go less than that. My apologies. Speak soon. Bye bye.